And what the hell is up with science journalism? Like, what is science journalism? Are you just writing? Is this for newspapers? How do you get into it either? Are these scientists? Are they journalists? Are they communicators? So I'm super excited today because today we have Dr. Layal Liverpool. She's on Twitter, she's on Instagram. By the way, her Instagram is rad. It's called Science Sped Up. You'll have the handles and everything as well, and they should be in the links below. But talking about diversifying science, talking about spreading science awareness and literacy, and also just kind of making it fun. No one wants to read through an academic paper when you're just trying to skim the news and see what is cool and what is out there. And science is awesome. Just a reminder, this is Ask Me I'm a Scientist. My name is Susanna Harris, and each episode I bring on a different expert so that we can ask them questions. You can drop those questions in the chat. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram so you can find the questions and send those in advance. This show is unscripted, uncut, and likely unprofessional, so you'll have to bear with us as we navigate. But without me talking anymore, let's flip over and talk to Layal. Hi Layal, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm very good. How are you, Susanna?
I am so excited to talk to you because, I don't know, it's like, one, you're across the ocean, so I just always think that's cool. But two, I mean, we met because we were on a panel together specifically talking about science communication. And science journalism is actually one part of communication that I have never considered. It's not something that really comes naturally to me. So I would love to hear a little bit more from you about, what is your background in, where are you coming from in terms of like science or journalism, and then definitely want to hear about how did you get into science communication?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you a bit, and then just feel free to throw any questions at me. I did a PhD at Oxford University, studying virology and immunology. So I come from academic background, and quite early during my PhD, I started to get interested in writing, journalism. I always enjoyed reading science stories in the news, and I was interested in my PhD topic, but I was also always interested in what, the person next to me on the lab bench was doing and what the next lab was doing and, other institutes were doing. And I started to realize, I'm quite interested in science in a really broad sense. And I think that's something that definitely is part of being a science journalist. So right now I'm working as a freelance science journalist. So that means that I pitch news stories or other science stories to different outlets, and then if they accept that, then I can write a story for them. And at the moment, I'm mainly writing for New Scientist magazine, based in the UK, but I'm based in Berlin, confusingly. And so I write about a range of science topics, so that can be tech, space, health, environment, climate change. Right now, a lot of coronavirus. So there's quite a lot to cover. And I'm happy to talk more about my experience between PhD and now, if it's interesting.
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, you just threw out a ton of things that I'm super interested in, and the response, especially on Instagram, for me posting that we're going to have this discussion, everyone wants to know what is going on in science journalism, especially if they're interested in science communication. I want to go over to, you just said something interesting of how many different topics you cover, and that you come from a science background. How does your science background prepare you for those things? Or do you ever have any problems, if someone says, hey, I want, or if you're saying, I want to write about COVID, and the next day you're talking about, I want to write about AI. How has your background prepared you for this? Or how do you do that at all?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's something that I would say I'm still learning every day, which is something I like about journalism, is that you are, as a PhD student, as a scientist, I was very much an expert in my field, in my area of research. And I was kind of an expert on this very narrow thing. Whereas now as a journalist, I find that it's much more about knowing a little bit about a lot of things. And I like that because it means you're just learning. You get to speak to the experts in each of these fields and then learn from them, read papers and learn there. But it's obviously really challenging because as a PhD student, you're so used to reading papers in quite a narrow field, because that's your job. You need to be absolutely on top of the literature and know what's going on in your area of research. And so that was a sharp change coming into journalism, where it's actually more important to know in general what's going on. And it's also really important to be able to read a paper that isn't in your field, which is going to be full of language that you're completely not familiar with. So what you realize is that scientists love jargon and abbreviations. And they usually overestimate the knowledge of those, and it's not just from speaking to scientists, but also trying to read papers, because there's obviously the kind of upstream step of journalism, which is finding stories that you think are interesting to cover, and then once you have a story that your editor has said, yeah, that's really interesting, go ahead and interview the researcher. Then the next step is to be able to speak to that researcher who is an expert in AI, for example, or theoretical physics, and sound smart enough that they trust you to write about their research and represent them, but also not sound too smart that they're going to start speaking to you in jargon that will be impossible to quote in your article. So it's a very delicate balance.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think the interesting thing about jargon, right, is that I think when we say jargon, a lot of people think of just, the alphabet soup kind of thing. It's a bunch of acronyms, but jargon can be as simple as like nano, or, even just like a word like chemical, to kind of suss that sort of thing out. What is your general audience, like when you're writing for these different news outlets, where are you generally trying to aim for, or do you work for different places that have totally different audiences?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm writing mainly for New Scientist, and previously I've written for The Guardian, and I've also written for some other blogs and publications. But I think, so at New Scientist, for example, I would say our readers are people who are interested in science, but still are not experts on the topics that we write about often. Whereas at The Guardian, for example, I would say the audience includes, because The Guardian is a general interest newspaper, right? So they cover everything. They have to cover whatever Donald Trump has said yesterday, or, so because they're covering such a wide range of stuff, their readers are a lot more general. And so it's more that you're trying to almost convince people to read about science. So it's slightly different there, because, so I would say The Guardian is a bit more general, and you need to, I would assume less. I would assume that people understand maybe less or are less interested in a topic. Whereas for New Scientist, I might say that there are people who are like always want to find out what's the latest thing in AI, and they'll come to New Scientist to look for that. So that's my kind of impression. And I think that it's important, actually, like as you've just kind of pointed out, to have the reader in your mind when you're writing or when you're pitching stories, and thinking like, what would people be interested in? Like one of my editors used to say that you need to always think about, how would you tell this to your friend, like when you're on a night out and you just want to tell them like, oh, this cool thing happened in science. Like, how would you say it to them in like a sentence? And if you can't say it to them in a simple way that's like engaging, then probably like that's not going to be a good story for any outlet, really, because you have to really understand it, and like, why is it interesting? Why should we care about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so I do want to know, how did you get into science journalism? Like, did you have a background in writing before this? Like, what does that look like? And I think one of the questions that I wanted to make sure to ask is from Instagram. CatXOXO said, how do you start a career while completing your master's or PhD? And I want to know a little bit more about what that transition looked like.
Yeah, I think I can speak to both of those, because I kind of started this journey during my PhD. So basically, yeah, during my PhD, I realized that I'm interested in, as I said, in kind of the broader side of science. I'm interested in space and other things, and I wanted to find a career where I could stay close to science, but also be able to kind of satisfy that curiosity I have to learn about other fields. And so I think I also started to realize that I really like writing early on, because obviously as a PhD student you have to write a lot of reports and eventually your whole thesis. And my supervisor, I remember, said to me at one point that you're quite an unusual PhD student, because he said, most students just want to stay in the lab all the time, pipetting stuff. I'm from wet lab science. And they're not so excited about writing things up and writing, whereas I was almost the opposite. I was just so keen to write everything down, and I love reading papers. I could get lost reading papers and things. So that was kind of a hint. And then I started to actually write for like a lot of university blogs, like department blogs. So just for free, like writing for fun alongside my work. And I started out writing a lot about my own research. So that's kind of how this started. I wanted to communicate my research to the public. And then I started to realize that there's lots of things that people are interested in, and people would ask me questions around my research. And I started finding myself looking things up like around my subject, in other subjects. And then eventually, in the penultimate year of my PhD, I applied for a placement. It's called a British Science Association Media Fellowship placement. So that's something in the UK. But basically, it's a scheme where they send scientists to a well-known media outlet for a short period of time. And the idea is to kind of improve the connection between scientists and the media. Mm. So I went to The Guardian for my placement, so The Guardian newspaper in London, and I was working on the science desk. And I literally arrived, and like on day one, I was like writing science stories, and it was really exciting. I really liked the thrill of, I think it was the contrast between, at that time in the second last year of my PhD, I was struggling with experiments, and everyone knows there can be a lot of repetition, and you feel like you're not going anywhere. And PhD has a very long-term deadline as well. Mm-hmm. And then at The Guardian, it's like I came, and in one day I pitched a story, I interviewed the scientist, I wrote the article, it was published like the next day.
Wow.
And I'm like, whoa! In science, it takes years to publish anything.
Yeah.
So that was kind of eye-opening for me. Like the kind of turnover time was different, and yeah, I liked the adrenaline of having those short deadlines, and I just loved interviewing researchers, learning about research from fields that some fields I've never even heard of. So that was really cool. So I kind of then decided, like, I actually want to do this as my job, like not just as a kind of placement. And so then I had one more year of my PhD. And so in that year, I started thinking like, okay, I started going to tons of career events and things, and I started talking to people who were in this field and asking like, how do I do this? How do I become a journalist? And they basically said, you need experience, get more experience. So I applied for an internship, and then after my PhD, I ended an internship at New Scientist magazine for 6 months. And I would say that's where I received like a lot of training, and so that was a really well-organized internship where we had mentors, we had like classes about journalism and about science writing specifically. So I learned so much from that internship, and then now I'm continuing to write for New Scientist and continuing basically that learning process. So I'm very much at the beginning of this career as well, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really, speaks to that question of how do you start a career? And I mean, at least what I have found with the stuff that I'm doing is it's like, for me, I'm not thinking about how do I start a career? It's more of like, how in the next few months, how will I improve my resume towards what I want to be doing? Or how do I get involved in the things that I'm really excited about right now? And like you're saying, it's all about that experience. It's finding those ways that you can actually put yourself into the system and just be able then, when you're applying for things, say, oh, this is my body of work. You're not asking for them to give you a chance. You're showing them what they're going to gain if they actually take on your stories.
Yeah, I also wanted to say, Susanna, that I was very inspired by your social media presence. Like during my PhD, I followed like a lot of like your main accounts on Twitter and Instagram, and also like PhD Balance. And I think social media is also a really great place where you can kind of learn journalism in a way, because it's like your social media account can be your own little like platform. It's like your magazine or your newspaper where you're kind of writing your opinions or sharing things you think are interesting. So I started doing that as well. During the last year of my PhD, I started an Instagram account called Science Sped Up, as you mentioned at the beginning. And that was really great because as I was writing, I was posting kind of time-lapse videos of scientific research in action. And then explaining what's going on in the clip in the captions. And so I was having to summarize science, again, from different fields and showing different people behind the science as well. And so that really taught me a lot and has definitely helped me in my journalism, I think.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit more about that page, because it's super cool. I think that, I mean, you're doing a lot with that page, right? It's not just here's some science sped up stuff. Like there's a mission behind that. Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think, yeah, for me, the the mission, it started during my own PhD, that like a lot of my family members and friends who are not in science were kind of just like, what do you do all day? Like, not just me telling them like, oh, I study viruses and how they invade the body, but it's like, what does that look like? Like, what does your day actually look like? And then I realized like, it's quite easy, like with just on your phone, you can just make these time-lapse videos. And I think a lot of my experiments in the lab were very like, perfect for making time lapses because they were quite long and repetitive. And it actually kind of motivated me at the end of my PhD. I'd be like, oh, I have to do another, like, I don't know, isolate DNA from bacteria again. And it takes a long time. And by filming it, I realized, like, it somehow I was like, oh, I'm being filmed. Like, now I need to do it like extra carefully. And then I got to share that with my friends and family. And then they started saying, oh, this is really cool. You should share like more of those. So I started the account, and initially I was sharing like clips of myself doing research. But then I started thinking it would be really cool to use that to like feature other scientists, and also for me to kind of connect with other scientists on social media and see what kind of research they're doing and what their science looks like. So that was kind of the idea. And then through that, I've discovered like so many scientists from like diverse backgrounds as well, which is really nice, I think, to show the breadth of people who do science as well. So that's been really fun, and it's an ongoing project. So if any scientists are watching, I would love to receive your time-lapse videos of you in the lab, or doing computational work, or whatever work you do. I would love to feature you on my account.
Yeah.
Little plug there.
Take Layal up on that. Like that handle is right below her, as it's the Twitter handle. I also want to see all this stuff. I never did a time lapse because whenever I did have to do those long experiments, I was like, just make it end. I just don't want to even think about it. So like, mad props to you for creating content. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting a bunch of good questions in the YouTube chat. PhD Princess says, what are some of your tried and true methods for finding stories to pitch? And I actually have my own question on this one of like, if the turnaround on this stuff is 24 hours, it's one thing to do a social media post about it. You know, I get to do that, like, oh, sweet, there's this new topic, I want to talk about it tomorrow, versus, you know, how do you find the stories that are interesting, important, and that you can actually cover in a few days before it's like kind of all over?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there are a lot of ways of finding stories, and to be honest, I'm still discovering that I think there are more ways that I could use for that. I would say the most kind of obvious answer, and probably the main way a lot of science news stories that you see are kind of discovered by journalists, is through journals. So when research is about to be published, usually journals, like especially the big journals like Nature, Science, Cell, they'll have a kind of press release that they send to journalists, and they'll kind of highlight what they think are the biggest stories that are going to be published. So they kind of pick out what they think is newsworthy. So that's a kind of like, I would say, easy way to find stories. And they'll usually tell you a couple of days in advance. So they'll say on Wednesday, this big story is coming out in Nature about, I don't know, a new dinosaur. And often those kind of stories will be widely reported. So if you've ever noticed that there was like a science story that was quite widely covered by a lot of news outlets, it's often because there was that heads up and they might have seen it coming in the journal. So the other way that I like to find stories is still looking at journals, but so when Nature sends us that email saying, hey, we think this story about dinosaurs is super interesting, they'll also below say like, and by the way, here are all the other papers that are coming out in Nature, Nature Communications, and all their journals. And so that's a huge list. But I spend a lot of time basically going through that list, because sometimes they highlight what they think will be the most interesting papers, but there may be like kind of hidden gems in the rest of that list. So I like to look through not just Nature, but like all kinds of journals to see what's going on in science, what's going on in the field. Is there something that I can expect to be coming out? And then the other way to kind of find stories is to basically have a good network of experts, of scientists. So I'm actually really proud, because like recently, I would say I've reached the stage where I'm now getting tips from researchers who will say, hey, I noticed that you've written really well on this topic, and I'd love you to cover our story, which is about this. And that's really great, because that gives me the chance to kind of also build that connection with the researcher, and also with researchers in that field. So that's one way that I find stories. And then I also look at preprint servers to see if there's something that, because often researchers will put things out on preprints before they get published, or they'll put things out that are kind of preliminary, but maybe it's still interesting enough that we want to report it. We want to say, oh, researchers are starting to do this cool thing. I'm trying to think. The other big way, which is a bit redundant, well, maybe not redundant, but is going to conferences. So there are a lot of virtual conferences, so it's not over. But yeah, in the past, definitely like physically going to conferences and just meeting researchers there. It's a great way to like find stories through the presentations, but also just through meeting experts and getting to know them, because then they might contact you next time and say, oh, you're my favorite journalist at New Scientist or wherever, and they might send you their story. Yeah. So I think those are kind of the main ways, and through tips. And so basically just the more you write, I think as a journalist, you also get experience with fields, and so you start to know in different fields what's the next thing that we're kind of expecting to come out, and then have good connection with researchers who can guide you as well. So I often when I interview researchers, at the end I'll say something like, like, it's been really interesting learning about your work. Could you guide me on what you think are the next big advances in this field, and are there any conferences that you'd recommend I attend to learn more about this topic, or papers that you'd recommend I read, or something like that?
Damn, girl, you're killing it. Yeah, I'm just like, oh my God, that's so much work. So,
it takes time. I would say people don't realize that journalists spend a lot of time just reading and just looking for stories. Like that is our job, is like to dig through this huge amount of information and pick what do we think is newsworthy, like what's interesting to share.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something I've never heard before, but like, so you're saying that if a scientist has a story that's coming out, you would actually like them to reach out to you, or like journalists would want someone to reach out. I feel like a lot of scientists don't want to do that sort of self-promotion, but like,
I mean, I think people should do it, because journalists are literally looking for stories. Like, our job is to find stories. So if you've done something cool, then I would definitely recommend to reach out. I'm probably now going to regret this when I got loads of emails. No, but I think it's worth definitely letting journalists know, but also letting them know in the right way. Like, for example, there's no point, like, I sometimes get emails from people saying like, hey, there's this really cool study. It was published like last year or like a year ago. And I'm like, that's great, but it's not news. You need to find out why, like, the question my editor is going to ask me when I pitch to them is, yeah, that's cool, but why now? Why should we cover this today and not, like, so it's great if you can, like, if you see that maybe there's been a world event, or maybe there's a conference coming up, or something's in the news that kind of ties in with your research, where you think that would give it a kind of a news peg, let's say, then that's a great way to kind of, connect with journalists and introduce them to your work. Also, one other thing, I think, if you're a scientist and you're willing also to comment on other researchers' work, so I often get independent experts to comment on work that I'm covering, then that's also a great way that, like, you now have a connection with that journalist. So I know you because you commented about this work. I know that you're an expert. So next time when you have work coming out, I might connect with you on that. And so that's also a really good way to for me to find stories, or for you to kind of present your work if you're a scientist.
Yeah, it's really funny, because it is really hard to do that stuff. Like, I think I reached out to you like 3 or 4 weeks ago. I don't know what time is, but like 3 or 4 weeks ago, I reached out to you and was like, would you want to do this thing? Like, I felt bad asking you, and I'm
so happy you asked me. It's great, and also it's nice for us to chat more. Like, I think you have a great platform. It's also interesting for me to learn more about that science communication world, and so I think it's great. People should do more chats like this.
Oh, well, thank you. Cool. There's so many questions. All right, so I do want to hop over, though, because something that you talked about when we first did this, like, the setup part, is talking about being a woman of color in STEM. But I think also I just would love to hear your experience, or, what you've learned as a woman of color in journalism, because that's also a really, like, historically white cis male dominated space. How do you think it's been? Have there been things that are really difficult, or things that you have to keep in mind? And then are there other things, like, does your personal identity help you navigate some of this?
Yeah, so I think, like, interestingly, you mentioned, like, being a woman in, or for me, like, as a black woman in STEM, or now, like, in journalism. I think there's actually, like, some link there, because I think my experience actually being like a person of color, like in academia, which is also quite a white environment, that kind of helped me in a way, like to kind of prepare for this industry, which again, like journalism is also quite white. But I think now I've one thing that I'm trying to do is like look for mentors. So this is also something that I would recommend to other like people of color who are interested in journalism, that you can try and reach out to people, and if you see someone who maybe like is like you, or someone who has like showed that they're open to help someone out, then I think it's a really good idea to reach out to people and kind of don't be afraid to firstly like ask for help, but also to kind of promote yourself, because I think that's something that it can be hard to do, especially when you feel that you're from an underrepresented group and you maybe don't see people like you doing the job that you want to do. So I definitely recommend that kind of, I mean, you could say networking, but it's also just really like connecting with people in a genuine way and trying to learn more. So that's something that I definitely did. I just reached out to anyone. I mean, most people like didn't reply or whatever, but there will be those people out there who really want to help and who will reply. And through the internship I did at New Scientist, for example, also at Guardian, it's like I've made connections in journalism, and so it's like sometimes just having one connection, it kind of leads you on to others. So that's something that has been helpful. And then also I think just try, like if you get a platform, then try also to like amplify other people like from your background as well. I also try to do a lot of like these kind of things, like this conversation that we're doing now, for example, because I think it's important that people see people from different backgrounds doing things. So I think when you asked me at first, I was thinking, oh, you know, I'm really early on in my career as a journalist, I don't have that much experience. But then on the other hand, I thought maybe if I come here, it's like I can still share the experience that I do have, and also maybe people can also see the kind of diversity that exists in journalism.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think when we think of a journalist, I certainly have an image that comes into my mind. It's usually the type of person that you see in front of the camera or sitting at a news desk at a news station. And for some reason, maybe this is, I don't know where this comes from, but I think back to, I watched the news a lot more when I was a kid, and I was a kid in Iowa. And so that's a very specific type of person. And I think it is. It's just... it's been cool to look through your stuff and just see how many different topics you've covered, and you know, how many different types of experiences you've had. And actually you just answered one of on Instagram, Quantum Leap Science said, how do you advocate yourself, and is it affected by being a woman and a person of color, or a Black woman in STEM? And it definitely sounds, I like your point about finding mentors and finding those people who will champion you, and then turning around and championing other people. And super appreciate you coming on. Like, if we didn't do it here, I would have just been like, can we just Skype? I think I sent that to you. Did I send?
Can we chat? Yeah. No, it's great.
So
thank you so much for inviting me.
No, I mean, you're awesome. Definitely want to respect your time, but like there were tons of questions. You've got your Instagram and your Twitter below. Are you comfortable with people reaching out to you via those and like asking some of the questions?
No, absolutely. I was going to say that, like, anyone, like, please feel free to, I think my DMs are open. You can contact me. I'm really happy to answer questions. Also it can be about, and I mean, also about science stuff, like from PhD times, also from like someone who's transitioning careers, starting a career in a pandemic. There are lots of things that I could speak to, and I'd be really happy to answer questions if there are more.
Awesome. And then I'm going to end with one question that I always do for people, and I always forget to prep them before the call. But it actually balances.
Great.
Yeah, I know. It actually balances really well too with a question that we just got in YouTube, which is from Sanjez Ahmed. Where do you see the science journalism field going in the next few years? So the question I usually ask folks is, like, in this specific topic, what are you interested in? What are you keeping track of? What are you wanting to learn about? Whether that's in science communication or journalism, you know, what's next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this field, well, I hope that this field will start to kind of recognize that there are different voices, there are different perspectives that we want to hear about. So, like, for example, like recently I wrote for New Scientist about why people from ethnic minorities, particularly Black people in the UK and US, are being disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's important that we kind of have, yeah, as I said before, just more diversity in the media to also highlight these different stories and different angles, because everyone sees the world from their perspective. And I think it's important that we kind of bring that into science communication and journalism, because science itself, we like to think of it as this kind of perfect neutral thing that is unbiased. But in reality, science is done by people, and people have bias, of course. But also people are interesting, and it's nice to also get the stories behind the science in a way, that those personal stories. Like, one of the questions I always ask when I interview people, just honestly for my own interest, is just, what is your personal motivation behind this work? Like, what's driving you? And I think I'd like to see a lot more of those kind of narratives as we communicate science and journalism, kind of telling the stories of science and also showing it in a real way. So we have a lot of this kind of single hero idea in science, like first author, like as if one person did everything on their own. And we know so much that this isn't true. And I just love talking to researchers, because they're always very, like, I think, very aware of that, you know, they're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, for example. And I think that's something really nice. And yeah, in terms of the actual discoveries, I'm excited. Maybe we're going to send people to Mars or something. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to be there to report on that. So
oh my God, I
check
love
out
that.
my stories.
That's amazing. You're like, I'm going to be there. I'm going to report on it. You keep track.
I'll be on Mars.
Hell yeah. So for everyone else, you heard that. You need to go follow Layal on Twitter, on Instagram. Check out this cool stuff. If you have exciting stuff that you want to talk about that's new, breaking, whatever, it sounds like you don't have to be the first author, which is nice. Reach out to Layal. I'm going to do my due diligence, which is to go back and put some examples of her work into this description. If you want to make sure not to miss those and not to miss future stuff, go ahead and click the like and subscribe. But Layal, thank you so much. This was super cool. Yeah, you're just awesome. And I hope, I don't know, I just want to meet you someday. So whatever.
Yeah, it's very nice to meet you virtually, and I hope that one day we would meet in person. Keep doing what you're doing, Susanna. I think this is a great channel. Everyone subscribe to Susanna's channel.
Excellent. I'll pay you later. No, this is great. All right. I will talk to you on the flip side. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. That was a really fun conversation. Your questions made it just go super fast. I always wish these conversations could be hours long. Luckily, you can continue and keep asking questions either to my stuff or just go follow our guests. The cool thing about our guests is that they are open to these conversations, and Layal's awesome. I'm sure you can ask her more questions, whether it's science journalism, whether it's different experience, science, like transitioning out of academia, so many different things. Go check her out. In the meantime, if you know somebody else that I need to be talking to who wants to be on this show, let me know. Go follow me on Instagram or Twitter. Reach out there. And in the meantime, keep asking your own questions, because there's a lot of really cool experts and there's a lot of really cool science out there. I'll talk to you soon.